It's January 10th, 2026. Russia is in its fourth year of the war against Ukraine. Today we'll look at the military situation. I'm Julian Röpke and this is Build Situation Room. And we'll start with another Russian tank push, this time in the Dnipropetrovsk region. There, Russian troops tried to storm the town of Novo Pavlka, a town they'd already entered a few weeks ago, but were driven back from there shortly. We're looking at footage from the 46th Brigade of the Ukrainian army that's defending this area, and we can clearly see that in total the Russians used 2 tanks and 2 pickups, which are attacking right here from different positions. So you can pretty clearly see drones being used against these vehicles and various mines going off here while the vehicles are basically moving forward, all happening in real time as they press on right now. Here we see one of the bigger tanks. We'll also get another shot of it in a moment, coming in from a different angle in better quality, but you can already see it pretty clearly here that the tank is basically moving toward the camera, heading north toward Novo Pavlka. Here's the drone strike, and right next to it, just over there, a mine has just exploded a moment ago. So that means there actually were a whole lot of defensive options available indeed. Here are the images I just mentioned of these tanks, which once a year for a short period of time turn into the so-called bristle tanks. So these metal constructions really stick out in all directions. These wild structures, basically the cage, to defend themselves against the drones in the end. We can see it here, but more often than not, the Ukrainian pilots still manage to find some angle or small opening to get at these tanks, at least to bring them to a full stop. And that's footage we pretty much have to cut off in the middle because there are about 10 to 15 Russian soldiers involved in that advance. And in the second half of the video, they're all hunted one after another by drones and artillery, tracked down relentlessly and then killed with brutal efficiency, leaving almost no chance to escape. So we have to stop it right here. We can at least already see the beginning. The Ukrainian effort, after destroying the vehicles, is now to pick off the individual soldiers. Here, for example, we can see them and take them out. The whole thing ends up once again a disaster for Russia, but it shows once more that Russia hasn't given up on its military advances, especially its mechanized pushes, and remains firmly intent on trying to gain additional contested ground in the Dnipropetrovsk region. Let's look at this on the map. And as I said, we have the town of Novo Pavlka here in the middle, right at the center of Russian interest. And Novo Pavlka is a strategically important town because at this spot down in the far southeastern tip of the Dnipropetrovsk region, it's basically still held by Ukraine, at least for the time being. We can see this dashed line here. So that's the oblast border between Dnipropetrovsk here in the center and Donetsk over on the lower right side of the map indeed. And the attack we just saw once again came from Dakne or Filia and was heading in this exact direction straight right toward Novo Pavlka itself. We can see the whole area is marked as contested, or at least part of it. We spoke with representatives of the 46th Brigade in Novo Pavlka this morning about the specific area. And they told us that by repelling this attack here, once again a Russian advance, a Russian consolidation of their position in Novo Pavlka could be successfully stopped for now. So there are still fights in the Dnipropetrovsk region. We've got another video that shows just how outrageous the Russians are acting here and that they're actually increasingly relying on cavalry, that they're using horses to move them straight to the front. And now we can clearly see how the Ukrainian drone pilots deal with it. They're trying, not at any price, but at considerable cost, to spare the horses and in many cases to a relatively high degree. And the Russian riders, how we call them whenever the Ukrainians can aim for them to kill them here. Let's take a look at the footage. Really, once again, pretty unique. We're looking at these snow-covered roads here in the Dnipropetrovsk region, and you can see several Russian riders out on the move right now, actually. Here's the first, here's the second, and here's the third. And judging by how the Russians are acting, these seem to be people who haven't had much experience with horses in their lives, so they appear quite unsure. Because just from fear of those drones, out of sheer panic, it's not the horses that freak out. It's the riders who freak out and are now falling off here, scared of the coming attack, stumbling and tumbling to the ground. Here we see the first Russian basically who isn't thrown off the horse, but actually falls off, and then the horse even steps on him. Now here the second Russian, there too the drone isn't directly attacking. It's not trying to hurt the horse itself, but basically keeps threatening until the Russian also falls off the horse. Now we see the next scene, and I find it really impressive because you can see the armed drone now coming straight at that horse, closing in very rapidly and menacingly, but then at the last moment it actually rises right over it and then flies back down. Now we saw that so as not to hurt the horse. Instead, the Russian soldier here is attacked. He'd also dismounted his horse and is struck repeatedly by the drone, which kills him in a sudden fatal blow shortly thereafter. We see back there are 3 horses and the 2 other riders. It's uncut and completely unchanged, exactly as filmed. So that means we can actually assume that, at least in this case, at least in what the video shows us, the attacks were aimed at the soldiers, not the horses, as the footage clearly shows, beyond any reasonable doubt. Which, of course, were used against their will by the Russian army during its unlawful invasion of Ukraine, part of its broader campaign of aggression. From Dnipropetrovsk, we move on to Kharkiv in the northeast of Ukraine. There we also have new footage showing us what the situation is like for the Russian soldiers still staying in Kupiansk and giving a clear impression of how precarious and uncertain their current position remains, namely pretty bad. We have footage showing that the hospital in Kupiansk is still being held by the Russian soldiers. And here we see how they get drinking water. They step outside, melt snow, and then drink it straight away, simply because they have no other water source available. So we see one of the Russians collecting snow for drinking water for himself and his comrades inside the hospital. He stepped outside to do it. And you can see him right away heading back into the ruins of this hospital. So it's barely cut here too, which makes it pretty clear for us to see and to pinpoint on the map exactly and easily without much doubt. We can see right now that he's going back into the ruins of the hospital here, which the Russians have occupied. And here you can see the hospital from above. It's already taken a few rounds, but it's still mostly intact for the most part. And now we'll soon see how various Ukrainian airstrikes on this former hospital are, well, going to play out right now. Hitting a Russian base. That was a relatively small blast. It could also be artillery, but now we're seeing fairly large, powerful explosions here and further back, which just show us that the Ukrainian Air Force is operating very precisely here. We can take another look at the whole thing. Interestingly, the second hit lands right in that crater, so that means people assume the Russians are still active at that spot, and the allegedly American or French bomb then lands and hits it dead center with almost surgical precision. This target is basically inside the hospital. It shows us that Kupiansk still hasn't been fully retaken by the Ukrainians, although, well, it's not shown that way on our map. As we'll see in a moment, there are still at least 3 spots inside Kupiansk that the Russians hold fairly firmly, and of course much of the city remains contested. That means Ukrainian troops advancing there, trying to cut off Russian resupply, and Russian soldiers in turn actively trying to either stop them or push them back. They are fighting and for that come out of their held positions. But that's very rare because the Russians know exactly what's in store for them if they come back without having done their job. And on the other side, soldiers are trying to reach the trapped Russians there to relieve them and bring some much needed support. We're looking at the whole situation. Let's zoom in here on the Kharkiv region and the Kupiansk region. And the footage we just saw from the area around the hospital, one of those last 3 red dots here, placed roughly right here on the map, basically right at this exact spot. Actually a bit further to the left, but anyway, we can see most of Kupiansk under Ukrainian control, largely recaptured. However, the city center is roughly here, is still contested by both sides. And, well, we've got these dark patches showing that, yeah, the Russians still firmly hold at least parts of the city, and the Russians also, don't forget, still have a reliable way to resupply themselves. We can see it's relatively thin, but the Russians only need a very thin supply corridor because they're basically risking being attacked from all sides, risk they'll be attacked by drones left and right and east and west, and still a few surviving soldiers somehow keep managing to get into the city alive. So you could say the Russians here aren't completely cut off, they're still being supplied both by land and air through various routes, and they're still trying to secure full and complete control of Kupiansk. We'll stay briefly in the Kharkiv region to look at further attacks by the Ukrainian army, which show that even winter only somewhat slows the fighting rather than halting or heavily curtailing operations. In the past few weeks, we've seen fewer advances from both sides, especially from the Russians, of course. However, logistics are still very active here. We can see buses from the Russian army trying to move forward and redeploy troops. We can see attacks on antennas. All of this, as I said, in Kharkiv, where the Russians are moving aggressively, trying to strengthen the positions they've taken and maintain firm control over them. Into their bunkers, it's snowy here, but they're still keeping them running and supplying the troops. And the Ukrainians are working hard to hit forward Russian units and various frontline positions here, constantly probing and striking where they can to disrupt supplies and command. Interestingly, we're also seeing a great deal more fiber optic guided drones right now than before. That means, while just a few weeks ago we were saying, yeah, about 5% of Ukrainian drones are fiber optic guided, I'd say right now we're seeing maybe up to 20%, maybe 25% of Ukrainian drone attacks, which are also playing out by targeting fiber optic guided drones. It quite clearly shows that the Ukrainians have also discovered the benefits of operating fiber optic guided drones. You're just less dependent on the weather and of course less affected by the enemy's electronic warfare. You do lose some range because you've only got 10 or 20 kilometers of cable and not like the Ukrainians did back then, chaining various repeaters to reach up to 30, so you can't stretch it further without extra gear and careful planning to strike 40 kilometers behind the border or behind the line. However, it seems to even out here, and the Ukrainians are increasingly as well using those new systems that Russia introduced last year, like modern FPV kamikazes. Russia for its part. And you'll see this in the footage coming up from Kostyantynivka in the Donetsk region where we're headed, now mostly uses fiber optic guided drones. You can see that in these attacks on the former 65,000 inhabitant town, this is brand new footage of one of the Russian army's elite units. What's also interesting, not just that the Russians keep attacking Kostyantynivka and using fiber optic drones, is that we're seeing more robots on the Ukrainian side that take over logistics. Yeah, we still have vehicles hit, pickups, sometimes armored, but repeatedly, as we see here, these robots that get under the nets, and you can see with the snow load, the nets are now barely usable any longer, sadly. We can see a lot has collapsed, a lot is hanging down. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians are trying to keep protecting the roads like this, so we keep seeing that alongside the small vehicles, these robot complexes are also being deployed. Here we see the next one. To keep logistics moving toward the front line, there's another robot. Toward the end, we also see the attack on an M109 Paladin, a self-propelled strike hitting a mobile artillery piece of the Ukrainian army, which is deployed or currently stationed in Kostyantynivka, reportedly positioned in that locality, according to local footage. You can clearly see it's a very tough situation for the Ukrainians who have to try to defend Kostyantynivka. But in this case, I think it's a bit contentious because you can see this artillery piece is dug in between several dakas and single-family houses in Kostyantynivka, quite literally sitting in the middle of a residential area. The Ukrainians argue pretty clearly, what are we supposed to do if not defend our cities in exactly this particular way? Of course, we've got to move our military forces and their vehicles into the cities appropriately and in good time as required. The Russians then claim as a convenient excuse why the cities must be destroyed. Yeah, there's Ukrainian military there, so you can't blame them for that. Yes, of course, the Russians are to blame for attacking. They themselves could stop. But we also sometimes see Ukraine in a situation where they literally bury that gun carriage, as you just saw here. Basically in residential areas, effectively using those positions to defend the city from those very spots. And you've got to fire out from the city to keep the Russians at the outskirts at bay. We're also looking at it on the map, seeing why the Ukrainians sometimes have no choice but to build their defenses inside the city, and of course to bring up the heavy weapons, so they defend outward from there. You see Kostyantynivka clearly. The footage we just saw came from all sorts of parts of the city. That means we've seen the Ukrainians active in and around the city, still controlling about 90% of the city. We can see some neighborhoods down there, the first Dasha districts down here in the far southeast right there. They're already under Russian control, the rest is contested. But very different from Pokrovsk or Mirnohrad, as we saw, the Ukrainian defenses are holding up better here. And Kostyantynivka, we see it, behind it there's Drushkivka. Then comes already Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. That means it's an extremely important city to hold the last two major cities in the Donbass. Kramatorsk, of course, and Sloviansk. So it's absolutely vital for the Ukrainian army there to hold their position at any cost whatsoever and keep the Russians out of the city. From Donetsk, we go back once more to the center of the country, the center that used to be the largest reservoir by area and extent, namely in Ukraine and in much of Eastern Europe, namely the Kharkiv reservoir. It no longer exists. The Russians actually blew up the dam intentionally. And that creates a kind of surreal landscape, a brand new, huge battlefield on the former bed of that reservoir, stretching for many miles and littered with wreckage. What it looks like, how a reservoir looks when you just drain the water out overnight, basically, you can see it right here. It's a really weird landscape, kind of steppe-like. And here we can see Ukrainian intelligence officers from the GUR, the military intelligence service, actually on the ground, moving about, who are trying inside this reservoir, I mean within the, like I said, operating on the reservoir's former shoreline. Here too, the Russians tried to push forward, basically to come further northward across the reservoir. Here we can see how Ukrainians are supplied. It's a huge area. You can't use a vehicle, of course, otherwise the drones will spot you. But you can't just go to the other side every night either, and it's just so many kilometers. Ukrainians are sometimes supplied, so here they get food delivered by their own small drones. Moving on from here now, that was 2, maybe 3 buildings. They're like little islands that used to be part of the reservoir. They move on now, and in the end even manage to actually capture Russian soldiers right here on the spot. Apparently there are 2 dead as well, but we don't actually see them in the video. We just saw basically the view to the south, the view towards Zaporizhzhia, into the Russian-occupied area. And here they have apparently managed to capture several Russian soldiers on what used to be the bottom of the reservoir. They're being taken back to the north bank. You can clearly see that happening. This whole area is really difficult terrain since it's so flat. There really aren't any places to hide. On the other hand, over the past 3 years, there's been quite a bit of growth here. Various types of vegetation have gradually taken hold and spread into areas where that plant life simply didn't exist before. Of course, under the many millions of tons of water, and now we see the Russians being taken away and eventually also becoming prisoners of war. So you can also see on the former bed of the Kharkiv reservoir there was fighting. Really strange footage and very rare stuff, because you'd think that former lake was basically the front between the two sides, until the Russians blew it up, which not only caused a major natural disaster and widespread displacement, but also made it a battlefield in southern Ukraine. We've just seen how much that changed things. Finally, we'll look at footage from Dnipropetrovsk, or from Dnipro, the city of 1 million in Dnipropetrovsk. There, the Russian army yesterday, with massive attacks, caused a total blackout across the entire city and surrounding areas. Not just Dnipropetrovsk, but also nearby Zaporizhzhia. The Russians are openly celebrating it. A pro-Russian account shared it. But it was confirmed by Ukraine. We're about to see that big flash now. That's probably one of the last power plants. Here we see it, a power plant that's been hit on the Ukrainian side. And the Russians were proud that dozens of towns and millions of people here now have to live in complete total darkness in the Dnipropetrovsk region and neighboring Zaporizhzhia. We mustn't forget, Dnipro still has over 1 million people, and Zaporizhzhia city, also under Ukrainian control, has about 700,000. That means these are really big cities, and the Russians are very proud that they have now managed to terrorize those millions of civilians so badly that in the coldest season they have neither heating nor lights at night, nor even basic utilities. So you can see the Russian attacks are continuing not just on the front lines, but also against the entire civilian population of Ukraine.